I interviewed for these 6 different big tech organizations, including Meta, Apple, Netflix, Amazon, Google, and TikTok. And I did get 4 offers. So today I'm going to be walking you through my overall experience, and I'm going to be categorizing my experience into 4 buckets. Number 1, the recruiting process. Number 2, the recurring theme across these interviews, and I'm going to overlay that with the culture. Number 3, the level of difficulties for each of these different interviews. And finally, my overall rating of the experience. So let's talk about the recruiting experience. For each of these big tech organizations, the recruiting process is typically very similar. However, there are some outliers. So typically you have the first recruiter call, which is a screening to evaluate your skills, experiences, and how they fit into the role. You must understand that that's an interview in itself. So make sure that you are prepared to talk about your skills relative to the role that you are interviewing for. The next step after that is speaking to a hiring manager. Now, the hiring manager is evaluating your fit into the culture of the organization and your fit into the team. If you make it through the hiring manager interview, then you would go to what they typically call the loop. Now, the loop typically takes about 4 to 7 interviews across different stakeholder groups, some leaders or some partners of the team that you're going to be working with. And in some cases, you might actually be interviewing with one person who's on the team that you are going to be a part of. If you make it through the loop, a decision is made regarding whether you're going to get an offer or not. Like I mentioned, there are some outliers. So for Netflix loops were actually longer. I had a total of 9 interviews for Netflix. Again, these are my unique experiences. So as you interview for these organizations, you might have a separate experience, but I'm speaking to my unique experience. The other difference was that for Google, once you get the recruiter screening, then you speak to somebody on the team, and then you begin to speak to different team members, because Google does not necessarily assign you to a team off the bat. They do what they call matching. So you may likely not speak to a hiring manager immediately until they match you to a specific team. In terms of the length of the interview, I found Netflix to be the longest, followed by Google because of the matching process. And then Meta was also a bit longer. TikTok was the fastest, and then Apple and Amazon kind of like tied in terms of the length of time. Category number 2, let's talk about the recurring theme across these different interviews. Let's start with Google. So Google obviously has a fleet of products. You may think that you know all the Google products, but trust me, you probably don't. So go do your research about all the different Google products, because a lot of the questions that they ask you are around their product. And if you are in the area of compliance or governance or risk management, they would likely be asking you to implement compliance practices for a specific product. In other cases, they may actually ask you to implement a compliance solution for a pseudo product that they believe that Google might implement in the future. I also found that the culture of Google is very chitty-chatty in the interviews, and so people are very nice, very warm, informal. However, that does not reduce the intensity of the interview. So just keep in mind that you want to match the energy of the interviewers at Google. They talk about this thing that they call Googliness, and so it's really about how you can collaborate, how humble you are. So just keep that in mind as you interview at Google. The next one we're going to be talking about is the Meta interview. The Meta interview, from my experience, was very focused on 2 things: scale and system architecture. Now, you already know that Meta has billions of users across their different products, but they also have goals to continue to increase those numbers. And so a lot of their questions are around how can you scale a solution for them. If you'd love to learn more about how you can scale solutions for organizations, put a comment down below, and I'll be sure to make a video on how you can scale. Another theme that was recurring as part of the Meta interview was understanding system architecture, process workflows, and just system design. While Meta started as Facebook, they did acquire companies like Instagram and WhatsApp. And what that technically meant was that they had to integrate these systems into their own systems for adaptability and just coherence. And so a lot of questions they're going to be asking you would be around your understanding of systems and how to embed compliance practices into those different system architecture. The third organization I'm going to talk about is Netflix. So the Netflix interview was really centered around their culture code. Once you begin the process of the Netflix interview, they're going to send you a document that contains their culture code. Make sure you read those thoroughly. As a matter of fact, when I was speaking to the recruiter during the screening call, he asked questions about the culture. Yes, they ask it very early on. So when you're answering questions, you want to make sure that you're grounding your answers in the culture. For example, they could ask you a question about how do you influence without exertion. You may want to talk about a concept in their culture called context over control, which just means that instead of trying to exert on people, you want to provide them context so they have better clarity to move forward in a certain direction. Another recurring theme around Netflix was that they like to dig deeper. Here's the thing. Netflix is not that type of interview where you're going to type something on ChatGPT, get a very surface theoretical answer and then take it there and then be good. No, they are going to dig deeper. They're going to look for real solid experience. I recall in one of the loops, I was asked the question and I provided the answer. And the interviewer said to me, what if that doesn't work? And I provided him another one and he kept drilling deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So be prepared to think on your feet at the Netflix interviews and don't be afraid to pause if you need to think deeper to answer a question because those questions can get really deep. And then for TikTok was pretty straightforward. If you are in compliance, TikTok is very big on jurisdictional laws, the GDPRs, the laws that have to do with implementing products or applications in a certain jurisdiction. So make sure you know all your laws regarding a compliance area. Another recurring theme for the TikTok interview was collaborating with stakeholders, especially around multicultural groups. And so you want to make sure that when you are communicating your responses, you're communicating like somebody who understands different cultures and understands how to collaborate with individuals. For the Amazon interview, Amazon is very big on leadership and there are a ton of behavioral questions in Amazon. When you are going for an Amazon interview, especially if you are going to be interviewing at the leadership level, I recommend that you have a number of real life stories in your back pocket so that when they ask you certain behavioral questions, you can bring those stories to support the answer that you are providing to them. And then the last but not the least is Apple. Apple is definitely customer centric. One recurring theme that I found about the questions relative to Apple was they required you to pay serious attention to details. If you are that person who loves to just skim over processes and skim over your presentation, then you have to do deeper work when you're interviewing at Apple because they're going to evaluate how much of attention you can pay to details. The next recurring thing that I found out while interviewing at Apple was that they're very focused on third party risk management. Yes. And it makes sense because a company like Apple on an average deals with like thousands of vendors, right? And so you want to think about how to manage third parties, especially from a compliance standpoint, if that's the area where you are interviewing for. All right. So now let's rank based on the level of difficulty. In my opinion, and based off of my experience, I would rank Google the highest. And this is because it's very focused on product and you really need to deep dive into how the products at Google work. You can't escape that. It requires a lot of innovative thinking on the spot, creativity, and that's what makes it an interview that you have to thoroughly prepare yourself for mentally. The second one that ties very closely with Google was the Netflix one. And it was partially because it was a very long interview, like there were many loops that you had to go through, but the people who were interviewing were extremely smart and they weren't just going to take surface responses, they were going to dig deeper. And so you have a lot of thinking to do on your fit, which makes it very, very intense. So the next one that I would say that ranks just right behind Google and Netflix is Meta. And that's because you really need to understand system architecture. They might have you design workflows, regardless if you're applying for a compliance role or a non-technical role. You really need to understand system architecture, system workflows, and how systems work in general. However, I didn't find it to be over the board. The next one, of course, would be Amazon. And I rank Amazon and Apple very closely together. And the reason why I rank Amazon and Apple very closely together is Amazon is very big on behavioral questions and leadership. And that's one of the areas where I thrive. So that's why it wasn't the biggest challenge for me. For you, it might be something that's challenging for you if you're not used to behavioral questions. So just make sure that you're taking all of these based off of your area of expertise. And then finally, TikTok. I found TikTok to be very execution focused. And so if you really understand how day-to-day processes work, you will thrive at the TikTok interview. And that's why I would rate that as my least challenging one. I want to mention that I have over 10 years of experience in my area. And so what typically might be challenging for some others may not be challenging for me. So I want to make sure that you are putting in the right preparation at your level of comfortability. All right. So finally, let's talk about my overall experience. In terms of my overall experience, I would definitely rank Netflix as number one. And the reason why I rank Netflix as number one is because the overall recruiting process was seamless. The next one right after that is Google. I love Google because people were super nice. Like everyone was just so sweet. Now it didn't diminish the fact that they were going to go intense on the interviews. The recruiters were also very responsive. The only reason why I rate them, just a little below Netflix is because of the matching process. Now, once you are done with all your interviews, the recruiter comes back to you and says you did fantastic. Everyone loved you. We're thinking about extending you an offer, but we have to do this matching process. And that matching process takes forever and a day. The next one right after that was Meta. Meta was great, very smart people. The overall recruiting process was also very seamless. Only reason why I ranked them a little below Google is just because I would have loved a bit of more responsiveness from the recruiters. Right after that would be Apple, and I rank Apple and Amazon very closely. The interviewers were a bit more formal. I could be a chitty chatty person, and so Apple and Amazon were very, very formal. I loved their culture. Everyone there was really smart. The interview process was also seamless. The cohesion was great. The final one I would say was TikTok. I actually had a great experience at TikTok. I loved the fact that everyone, who was engaging me at TikTok was super smart. I would say that the way that the recruiters typically communicate their culture is not something that I'm typically used to, but I guess it might work for some other people. And I'm truly grateful to have interviewed for all these organizations. And if you've interviewed for any of these big tech companies, please feel free to put in the comment. I'd love to hear your experience.